Imagine a scenario for a second. You're perfectly free, like absolutely free.
Right.
There are no laws stopping you from moving to a new city, no government agents preventing you from, starting a business,
Yeah.
and absolutely no restrictions on what you can say or who you can hang out with. On paper, you are the absolute master of your own destiny.
Sounds pretty ideal.
Right. But here is the massive catch. You have $0 in your bank account.
Yeah.
You have no health insurance, and you are literally starving.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So the question is, are you actually free?
I mean, it's the kind of question that forces you to just completely rewire how you look at the world,
Exactly.
Because the moment you start, like, pulling at that thread, you realize that the words we use every single day, words like liberty, choice, freedom, they might not actually mean what we think they mean.
Yeah, and that is exactly what we are exploring today. So welcome to today's custom-tailored deep dive. We've got this massive stack of notes here.
It's quite the stack.
It really is. We've compiled a ton of historical research, philosophical arguments, economic theories, all to answer this one really explosive question.
And it is fiercely debated, yeah.
Probably one of the most fiercely debated questions of the last 100 years, honestly, which is socialism actually compatible with individual freedom?
Right. And before we go a single step further, I think we really need to establish the ground rules for how we're navigating this today.
Oh, absolutely.
'Cause, I mean, the moment you put the words socialism and freedom in the same sentence, the temperature in the room just skyrockets.
It really does. People have incredibly personal, deeply entrenched views on this stuff.
Yeah, so let's just be crystal clear with you, the listener. Our goal today is not, I repeat, not to tell you who is right or who is wrong.
Definitely not. We are absolutely not taking sides here.
No, we aren't endorsing any specific political ideology, left, right, or center.
Right. Our job is just simply to pull back the curtain on the mechanics of both of these arguments.
Exactly. Think of us as your impartial guides
Yeah.
through a very complex, very heavily guarded philosophical minefield. We just want to show you how these perspectives are built.
Right, like what assumptions they actually rely on and where they fundamentally collide.
Precisely. We are just mapping the territory for you.
And the absolute center of that territory, the core tension that drives almost every modern political debate, is this massive assumption that we are forced to make a binary choice.
Yes. The either-or trap.
Right. The assumption is that you can either have economic equality and social justice, or you can have personal freedom and individual autonomy. You just can't have both.
It's the idea that you have to sacrifice one to get the other.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we just accept that binary choice, I mean, we are accepting a pretty grim view of human potential, right?
We really are. We're
Okay.
basically saying a fair society has to be a little bit tyrannical, or a free society has to be a little bit cruel.
Exactly. But to figure out if that opposition is actually, true, we have to start by defining our terms.
Yeah, definitions are key here.
Because honestly, judging the compatibility of socialism and freedom is literally impossible without realizing that neither of those words has a single, simple definition.
That is the ultimate stumbling block right there. When people argue about socialism, they're very rarely actually arguing about the same thing.
Yeah.
Broadly speaking, I mean, socialism is this economic and political view that criticizes the private concentration of economic power.
Right. It seeks some form of stronger collective control over resources, production, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But the forms that collective control can take, I mean, it represents a massively wide spectrum.
Oh, yeah. We are talking about vastly different realities. Like, on one end, you have democratic socialism and social democracy. These are systems that often maintain a market economy, but they rely on, heavy progressive taxation, incredibly strong labor unions.
Robust social safety nets, like the Nordic models, for instance.
Yeah, exactly, the Nordic models. Then you have worker cooperatives, right? Where businesses operate within a free market, but they're entirely owned and democratically managed by the employees themselves.
Right. And then, on the complete far extreme of that spectrum, you have centrally planned economies.
Right, the command economy.
Yeah, highly centralized, often one-party states that control just about every single aspect of economic life.
Let's drill down into that difference because it really is everything.
It's huge.
Yeah.
Just imagine the sheer logistical difference between a democratic welfare state and a centrally planned command economy.
Right.
In a command economy, a centralized bureaucracy is, quite literally, trying to calculate how many size 9 shoes need to be produced for the entire population.
Oh, wow. for like the next 5 years.
Exactly. They are deciding the price of bread, the allocation of steel, the wages of every single factory worker.
So the state is essentially everything.
Yeah, the state becomes the sole employer, the sole landlord, and the sole provider. Now, compare that to a system where, say, a group of 20 bakers simply decide to equally share the profits and the management of their neighborhood bakery.
While just operating within a standard market.
Exactly. The implications for individual liberty in those two scenarios, they're completely incomparable.
It's like trying to judge sports without knowing if we're talking about a friendly game of chess in the park or full contact tackle football.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, the rules, the risks, the physical environment, they're just completely different. So when critics and supporters are, going at it on television or online, are they even talking about the same version of socialism?
This raises an important question. And honestly, the answer explains why our political discourse is so frequently paralyzed these days.
Yeah.
Because, to use your football analogy, the two sides aren't just playing different sports, they aren't even in the same stadium.
Right.
A critic might point to a centralized authoritarian command economy, let's say the Soviet Union in the 1950s, and use that as the ultimate undeniable proof that collective economic control destroys human freedom.
Which, makes sense from that perspective.
Sure. But meanwhile, the supporter they are arguing with might be advocating for a decentralized system of, like, worker-owned tech startups in modern-day Ohio.
Right, completely rejecting the centralized authoritarian model the critic is even attacking.
Exactly. They're essentially speaking two completely different languages.
And the critic would probably push back on my sports analogy entirely, wouldn't they?
Oh, absolutely.
They'd likely say, hey, it doesn't matter if you're playing chess or tackle football if the government owns the board, the stadium, the ball, and pays the referee.
The game is rigged.
Yeah, the game is inherently rigged from the start.
Exactly. The critic argues that the mechanism of collective control, no matter how small it starts out, inevitably trends toward centralization.
Right.
But until we force both sides to explicitly define which architecture they are defending or attacking, we really can't accurately assess the impact on freedom.
So socialism isn't a monolith. That much is super clear.
Not at all.
But we have to look at the other half of the equation, too. Because freedom is arguably an even messier word.
Oh, much messier.
And honestly, diving into the philosophical definitions of freedom completely shifted how I think about my own daily life.
It is a vital distinction, and it goes back to the work of political philosophers like Isaiah Berlin.
Right.
He famously categorized liberty into two distinct types: negative freedom and positive freedom.
And understanding the difference between these two is basically the master key to unlocking this entire debate, right?
It is the absolute core of it.
Okay, let's break those down. So negative freedom is often defined as the freedom of being left alone.
Yes.
It is freedom from interference, freedom from coercion.
Correct. It is the absence of external obstacles. Like, if no one is actively stopping you from doing something, you possess negative freedom. The classic examples are the freedom to choose your profession, the freedom to buy and sell goods on an open market.
Freedom of speech.
Yes, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the freedom to own private property, and fundamentally, freedom from government intrusion.
Right. It's the freedom we usually think of when we hear the word freedom.
Exactly. It's the default definition for most people.
And critics of collective economic systems, they almost exclusively focus on negative freedom, don't they?
Almost entirely. Their primary burning concern is that heavy taxation, wealth redistribution, bureaucratic market regulations, all of that inherently creates external obstacles.
Right. It actively interferes with an individual's negative liberty to do whatever they want with their own property.
And the fruits of their own labor. Precisely.
So like if the government taxes you at 50%.
The critic argues that your negative freedom has been tangibly reduced.
Because an external force, the state, has coerced you into parting with your property.
Right, under the threat of imprisonment, ultimately.
Yeah. But this is where the perspective flips entirely, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Because supporters of social safety nets and collective economics, they focus almost entirely on positive freedom.
Which is sometimes referred to as substantive freedom, right?
Yes.
And positive freedom isn't just about being left alone. It's about having the real capacity to meaningfully direct your life.
Exactly. It's the difference between having the right to do something
Right.
and having the actual ability to do it. Positive freedom is freedom too.
So it's the freedom from desperate dependence.
Yes, it means having access to education so you can actually understand your choices.
Yeah.
It means having health care so an illness doesn't just bankrupt your family overnight.
Or having enough economic security that you can, confidently say no to an abusive employer without fearing eviction.
Exactly. Supporters argue, very compellingly, I might add, that a person who has no savings, no health care, and no bargaining power might be technically free in the negative sense.
Like the government isn't legally forcing them to work in a dangerous factory?
Right. But they are completely unfree
Uh,
in reality. They are chained by absolute necessity.
okay, let me try an analogy here. I love analogies.
Go for it.
So negative freedom is like having an unlocked door in your house.
Okay.
The government hasn't barricaded the exit. No one is legally stopping you from walking out.
Right. The obstacle is removed.
But positive freedom is actually having a pair of shoes, a map, and enough physical health to walk out that door and survive the journey.
Yes.
You literally need both if you actually want to travel somewhere.
That is a perfect visualization of the philosophical divide. Really, that nails it.
But here is where I really have to push back, because this is where the rubber meets the road.
Okay, let's hear it.
If positive freedom is about providing everyone with the shoes and the map, right, those things don't just magically appear out of thin air.
They do not.
Providing positive freedom inherently requires taking resources from someone else. It requires taxation, redistribution, or, regulating someone's business. So doesn't focusing on positive freedom mathematically require reducing someone else's negative freedom?
What's fascinating here is that this exact unavoidable trade-off is the absolute bedrock of the debate.
Right.
You have hit on the central nervous system of modern political conflict, providing positive, substantive, freedom-like guaranteeing that every single citizen has healthcare or housing requires immense resources.
Huge resources.
And in a society where wealth and resources are unequally distributed, gathering those resources means taxing wealth, regulating markets, restricting certain types of private ownership.
Right.
So yes, to guarantee the positive freedom of the many, you inherently must reduce the negative freedom of the few.
Like the freedom of a multi-billionaire to keep all of their capital entirely untaxed.
Exactly. The debate isn't about whether we can have total freedom. It is a negotiation about which forms of freedom we prioritize as a civilization.
Wow. And acknowledging that trade-off that we might, willingly reduce some negative freedom to build a social safety net, that opens the door to the critics' absolute strongest objections.
It really does.
Because if we agree that it is okay to give a centralized authority the power to take resources and plan outcomes for the sake of the collective, we immediately hit a wall.
Yes, the risks.
Right. What are the cascading risks of doing that?
The objections to collective control are profound, and they are rooted in a deep, deep skepticism of concentrated power.
Okay.
There are three major arguments regarding how moving towards socialism can fundamentally threaten liberty. The first, and perhaps most prominent, is the terrifying prospect of expanding state power too far.
Yeah.
The argument is that if the state, or any collective institution, controls too much of the economy, it gains an incredibly dangerous, almost insurmountable level of power over the individual citizen.
Because it affects literally everything.
Yes.
I mean, if the state manages the economy, it manages jobs, income, housing, the media, movement, literally every metric of human survival.
Exactly. The core danger here is the fusion of economic and political power.
Oh, that's interesting.
Think about the separation of powers in a standard democracy.
Yeah.
We separate the executive, legislative, and judicial branches to prevent tyranny.
Right. Checks and balances.
Critics argue that capitalism, for all its flaws, essentially separates economic power from political power.
Okay, I see.
But in a deeply centralized socialist system, that separation completely vanishes. The entity that creates the laws, enforces the laws, and commands the military is the exact same entity that writes your paycheck,
Manages your apartment building.
decides whether you get a promotion.
Wow. So if you anger the government politically, they don't even need to arrest you.
Yeah.
They just fire you and evict you.
Exactly. When citizens become entirely dependent on a single centralized authority for their basic survival, the risk of coercion skyrockets.
That is
It
terrifying.
leads to an environment of absolute political conformity. It creates what has been described as an inefficiency with no exit.
Wait, inefficiency with no exit, what does that mean?
Well, if you are oppressed by a terrible boss in a free market system, you can theoretically quit, walk down the street, and find another employer.
Right. You have an exit.
Exactly.
Right.
But if the state is the only employer, there is no exit. You cannot quit the government.
Right. So what does this all mean, like, for the everyday person? Because if we look at the second and third objections, they seem to build directly on that fear of a trapped society.
We do.
The second objection is that restricting choice limits entrepreneurial activity and market experimentation.
Yes.
And the third is that the pursuit of total equality becomes an excuse for uniformity. And this is the part I really want to dig into.
Okay.
There's this concept in the source text of the moral downgrade of the individual.
Right, yes.
If a society starts operating entirely on the mantra of, we know what people need and the collective goal comes first, doesn't that inherently kill innovation?
It certainly threatens it.
Like, where is the space for you, the listener, if you want to invent something wildly new, or build something that seems crazy to everyone else, or simply live a life that doesn't fit the collective plan?
It is a profound concern.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes far beyond economics into the realm of culture and human psychology.
Yeah.
Let's extrapolate on what happens in a society where personal preference must constantly yield to social planning. Innovation inherently requires risk.
Right, and failure.
Yes, trial, error, and very often going aggressively against the grain of what the collective currently understands or values. I mean, every major technological breakthrough initially looked like a complete waste of resources to the majority.
Right. If you go to a central planning committee in, say, 1990,
Okay.
and you say, hey, I need $1 billion to build a global network so people can share photos of their breakfast.
Laugh you out of the room.
Exactly. The committee is going to say, absolutely not. We need that money for bridges and healthcare.
Exactly. If a centralized collective controls the allocation of all resources, it will inherently be risk-averse.
That makes total sense.
It will prioritize known, immediate needs over speculative, disruptive ideas. Furthermore, if the rewards for risk and innovation are severely limited in the name of maintaining strict equality,
Then why bother?
right, the incentive for individuals to push boundaries diminishes. But the deeper fear, the moral downgrade you mentioned, is that a society utterly obsessed with equality might begin to view difference, unique ambition, or just standing out from the crowd as inherently dangerous.
Or antisocial, yeah.
Yes. If the highest virtue is the uniform collective good, then the individual ceases to be an end in themselves. They become merely a cog, a tool to be utilized by the state.
That is a chilling thought. A world where being different is viewed as a literal threat to the system.
It is.
But we can't just sit with that fear because the philosophical framework demands that we flip the lens entirely.
Right, we have to look at the other side.
The critics paint a very frightening, very vivid picture of state control, but the supporters of collective economics ask a very pointed question. What if the alternative, the unfettered free market, is just masking its own brutal brand of coercion?
And this requires us to fundamentally rethink how we experience our daily lives, particularly our working lives.
Oh, absolutely.
The strongest case for socialism begins with the argument that market dependence is, in itself, a deep, pervasive form of unfreedom.
Right.
Capitalism, supporters argue, hides this absolute dependence behind the polite language of contract and choice.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's talk about the illusion of choice.
Okay.
Say your so-called choice in the free market is to work in physically degrading, exhausting conditions for minimum wage, or
what?
Or to lose your housing, lose your ability to feed your kids, and lose your health care.
Right.
Is that a real choice? I mean, it's like a mugger pulling a weapon on you in a dark alley and saying your money or your life.
That's a grim image, but accurate.
Sure, technically, you made a free market choice to hand over your wallet. Right. You signed the unwritten contract, but you were forced by the imminent threat of violence. In the market economy, supporters argue, you are forced by the imminent threat of starvation and destitution.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the socialist critique of wage labor.
It really hits home, doesn't it?
It does. Supporters argue that the so-called freedom of contract in a capitalist system is often a total illusion for anyone who doesn't already own capital.
Right, because the power dynamic is totally skewed.
Exactly. If one party owns the factory and the other party only owns their ability to labor, the negotiation between them is inherently coercive.
So it's not a negotiation among equals.
Not at all. Therefore, the goal of socialism isn't to restrict freedom. It is to free people from domination by private employers.
From dependence on inherited wealth.
Yes, and from the constant, terrifying vulnerability to market shocks, things like sudden layoffs, medical bankruptcies, or economic recessions.
So by guaranteeing those social rights we talked about earlier, healthcare, housing support, unemployment protection, you aren't putting chains on people. You are taking the chains off.
Precisely. And this ties directly into a concept known as economic democracy.
Wait, economic democracy sounds, it sounds amazing on a bumper sticker.
It does, doesn't it?
But I'm really struggling to see how that actually works in practice. Like, are we talking about line workers voting on what color to paint the break room? Or are we talking about democratic voting on the CEO's salary and corporate strategy?
Because those are two drastically different realities.
Exactly.
We're talking about the latter. Economic democracy addresses a profound contradiction in modern society. We believe deeply in political democracy, right?
Right. Everyone gets a vote.
We believe that you should have a vote, a voice, and constitutional rights in how your government is run. Yet the average person spends the vast majority of their waking hours at a workplace where they have absolutely no democratic rights whatsoever.
Wow. That's true. You walk into the office lobby, you swipe your badge, and you essentially leave your democracy at the door. You enter a dictatorship.
That is exactly how critics of capitalism frame it. In a traditional corporate structure, power is entirely top-down.
You have no voice in the company's direction.
No say in the distribution of the profits you helped create.
And no control over the conditions of your own labor.
Precisely. Socialist thought proposes extending democratic principles into our economic lives.
How does that actually function, though, in the real world?
It can take many forms. It could mean legally mandated union representation on corporate boards, which is actually quite common in places like Germany.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Or it could mean entirely worker-owned cooperatives. Take the Mondragon Corporation in Spain, for example.
What's that?
It is a massive federation of worker cooperatives. Employs tens of thousands of people. The workers elect the management. They vote on the pay ratios between the highest and lowest paid employees.
Wait, they vote on the pay ratios?
Yes.
Yes.
And they democratically decide how to reinvest profits. The goal is to ensure that you are not just a democratic citizen on election day, but a democratic participant in the economy every single day.
Okay, so if we look at how this changes a single person's life, if you actually have that baseline safety net, if your healthcare isn't tied to your employer, and you have a democratic voice at work, it doesn't just make you comfortable.
No.
It creates agency.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, providing that baseline of security is actually the ultimate catalyst for the innovation and risk-taking that critics claim socialism destroys.
Wait, really? How so?
Think back to your earlier point about the listener who wants to invent something new.
The breakfast photo app.
Yes, exactly. In a hyper-capitalist system, if leaving your job to start a risky new tech venture means losing your family's health insurance and facing potential homelessness if you fail...
You are highly unlikely to take that risk.
Exactly. The market has coerced you into playing it safe. But if those basic needs are structurally guaranteed, you have the substantive, positive freedom to walk away from a stagnant job.
To pursue further education.
Or to start a bold entrepreneurial venture without the paralyzing fear of absolute ruin. In this view, a strong social safety net isn't a hammock, it's a trampoline.
A trampoline. I like that. Okay, so we have these two incredibly compelling, philosophically rich, theoretical arguments.
We do.
The critics look at state control and say, that inherently destroys liberty. The supporters look at unfettered market domination and say, no, that inherently destroys liberty.
Right.
But we don't live in a theoretical vacuum, right? We can't just debate this on a whiteboard. We have to look at what happens when these theories actually collide with human history.
And this is where the conversation has to confront a very difficult, very bloody historical reality.
Yeah.
When we look at the 20th century, many states that explicitly called themselves socialist or operated under the banner of revolutionary Marxism-Leninism became deeply, brutally authoritarian.
There's no sugarcoating it. We are talking about regimes that actively suppressed dissent, centralized absolute power in the hands of a few,
Censored all media.
restricted the physical movement of their citizens, and violently crushed any form of political pluralism.
Yes.
I mean, the gulags, the secret police, the manufactured famines, it is a dark, undeniable history.
It is.
Now, defenders of collective economics argue that these regimes represent one specific, corrupted, authoritarian path.
Right.
They argue it is a betrayal of the moral idea of socialism, and they point to modern social democracies or localized cooperative economics as the true path forward.
That's their defense, yes.
But I have to press you on behalf of the listener here.
Go ahead.
Is it really fair for modern supporters to just wave away mountains of historical atrocities by saying, well, that wasn't my version of socialism?
It's a very fair question.
Like, doesn't the sheer repetition of these authoritarian outcomes suggest that the freedom problem might be built into the system itself, rather than just being a series of, historical accidents?
You are touching on the absolute most intense historical debate surrounding this entire topic. Is authoritarianism a built-in feature, a bug in the code of collective control? Or is it entirely dependent on the specific context of a given country?
Right.
Critics absolutely, unequivocally argue that it is built in. Economists like F.A. Hayek famously argue that centralized planning inevitably leads to totalitarianism.
Inevitably. Why?
Because you cannot have a centrally planned economy without forcing people to comply with the plan.
Oh, right. Because if the state decides we are producing tractors instead of cars this year, and you decide you want to build cars in your garage and sell them, you are suddenly an enemy of the state plan.
You are a criminal.
Wow.
Exactly. The critics argue that once you centralize economic power, the temptation, and more importantly, the mechanical means, to centralize political power become irresistible.
Because they have all the levers.
Right. If the state controls the printing presses, the server farms, the distribution of paper, and the food supply, it is almost a mathematical certainty that those tools will eventually be used to silence opposition.
The mechanism for total control is already fully constructed. You just have to flip the switch.
Exactly.
Like, if you write an article criticizing the president doesn't have to send the secret police to your house. He just tells the state-owned paper mill to stop delivering paper to your printing press.
Precisely. However, defenders strongly contest this inevitability.
Okay, what's their counter-argument?
They refuse to accept that collective economics must lead to the gulag. They argue that the authoritarian regimes of the 20th century emerged in highly specific, incredibly volatile historical contexts.
Give me an example.
Take the Russian Revolution. It occurred in a desperately poor, feudal society devastated by World War I, with zero prior tradition of democratic institutions.
Right. The Tsar wasn't exactly running a democracy.
Exactly. Defenders argue that trying to build socialism in a war-torn, isolated, undemocratic country is what led to tyranny, not the economic theory itself.
So their argument is that if you build these systems on a foundation of strong, pre-existing democratic rights, the outcome is totally different.
Yes. They argue that collective economic control, when explicitly coupled with robust democratic institutions, strict constitutional limits on state power, and a fierce cultural commitment to civil rights, does not inevitably lead to tyranny.
So context matters.
Completely. They point to countries with strong social democratic traditions, nations that have maintained incredibly high levels of political freedom and human rights alongside heavy market regulation, universal health care, and robust welfare states.
Right.
The debate fundamentally hinges on whether you believe the economic system automatically dictates the political outcome, or whether strong democratic guardrails contain the inherent risks of centralizing economic power.
That brings us to a crucial turning point in our deep dive today.
It does.
Because if pure state control historically risks sliding into authoritarianism,
Right.
and pure unfettered market forces inevitably lead to economic domination and exploitation of the vulnerable, where does that actually leave us?
What is the solution?
Right. What's the solution? The philosophical map we are exploring ultimately guides us toward a synthesis.
It does, by asking us to elevate our thinking way beyond simple tribalism.
Yeah.
The ultimate question we have to ask is, freedom from what and for what? A truly wise analytical approach requires rejecting the absolutes on both extreme ends of the spectrum.
Okay.
The extreme libertarian view that any collective economic control inherently destroys freedom is simply too narrow. It willfully ignores how extreme poverty, precarious living conditions, and absolute workplace domination actively crush human liberty on a daily basis.
But the other extreme is just as flawed, right?
Completely.
The utopian idea that perfect equality and social planning will automatically produce freedom is dangerously naive.
Yeah.
Because, as the 20th century violently demonstrated, concentrated public power can become oppressive incredibly fast.
Exactly. So the synthesis we arrive at is that genuine, durable, individual freedom fundamentally requires both protections.
Both.
It requires rigorous protection from excessive, overreaching state control, and it requires equally rigorous protection from private economic domination and deprivation.
So a truly just and free society cannot rely on a single simplistic mechanism.
No, it requires a delicate, highly complex, and constantly maintained web of institutions.
It's about using the right tool for the right job while constantly keeping an eye on the person holding the tool.
Yes, that's a perfect way to phrase it. A free society needs markets to allocate certain complex resources and drive innovation efficiently. But it desperately needs strong labor protections and regulations to prevent exploitation within those markets.
Right.
It needs public goods and robust social safety nets to ensure positive freedom. The map and the shoes from your analogy earlier.
Right, you need the map and the shoes.
But it needs rigorous, transparent democratic institutions, an independent judiciary, and ironclad civil rights to ensure the state providing those goods doesn't overstep its bounds and become tyrannical.
So for our listener who just wants to understand how to view the chaotic world around them, the real question isn't socialism versus capitalism or equality versus freedom at all, is it?
Not at all.
It's much deeper than that. It's about how we design institutions to prevent domination, period. Whether that domination wears a government badge, a military uniform, or a corporate logo.
That is the absolute perfect distillation of this entire exploration.
Thank you.
Let's extrapolate on what this nuanced, synthesized answer looks like in your daily life as a citizen evaluating the world.
Okay.
When you hear a new policy proposed by a politician, the first question in your mind shouldn't just be a knee-jerk, is this socialist or is this capitalist? Those labels are often just thought-terminating cliches.
Right. They just shut down critical thinking completely.
Exactly. The much more profound analytical questions you should ask yourself are, does this policy actively reduce domination by concentrated wealth?
Okay.
And if it does it achieve that goal without simultaneously increasing domination by the state bureaucracy?
That's the tightrope.
It is. True freedom is not guaranteed simply because a government is weak, because massive private monopolies will gladly, instantly step into that vacuum to control your life.
Oh, 100%.
Nor is freedom guaranteed simply because a market is heavily restrained, because an unchecked, opaque, bureaucratic state can be equally suffocating.
Right.
The ideal compatibility relies on political frameworks that are highly pluralist, intensely democratic, fiercely rights-protecting, and inherently anti-authoritarian. We must actively limit and fracture concentrated power wherever it forms, whether in the boardroom or the Capitol building.
What an absolute marathon of an intellectual journey.
It really was.
Speaking directly to you, the listener, we know exactly why you join us for these deep dives. You don't tune in because you want simple slogans or easy, comforting answers.
No, you tune in because you aren't afraid of the gray areas.
Exactly. You are looking for the underlying architecture of how the world actually works, how history shapes our present, and how philosophy dictates our future. And today's exploration provided an incredible blueprint for doing exactly that.
I agree.
To wrap up this journey, we want to distill all of this complexity down to 3 core reflection questions for you to ponder as you go about your day.
These are straight from the source text.
First, when you look at your own life and your own community, do you feel more threatened by the potential overreach of state power or by the crushing weight of economic insecurity?
So tough one.
Second, can a person be considered truly free if basic survival forces them to accept domination and exploitation at their workplace?
Right.
And third, what actually matters more for human liberty? Having fewer rules and regulations or having more real, actionable options to direct the course of your own life?
Those are incredibly powerful, clarifying questions.
Yeah.
And if true freedom requires vigilantly, constantly limiting both state power and market domination, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to consider about our immediate future.
Oh, I like this. What is it?
Well, we have spent this entire time talking about the state and the market, right?
Right.
But as technology, surveillance architecture, and artificial intelligence become the new ultimate resources in our society, the game board is changing entirely.
Oh, wow.
Will these incredible algorithmic tools make it easier for us to democratically balance state and market forces? Or are we about to see entirely new, unprecedented forms of domination that don't fit neatly into either the 20th century box of capitalism or the box of socialism?
That's intense.
Are we facing forces of algorithmic, data-driven control that are so pervasive, so subtle, and so powerful that we haven't even invented the words to name them yet?
Now, that is a truly staggering thought to chew on.
It is.
The landscape of freedom is, it's always shifting. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking past the simple labels, and as always, keep exploring the depths. We'll catch you on the next one.